a day was allocated per man, and the rare treat of a bar of chocolate to be shared between 3. Half a gill of rum, amounting to 1 double measure, or, when supplies were exhausted, a pint of porter, the soldiers' version of lager, had promised a tantalizing moment of numbness before the recipient was expected to go and fight for his life. One soldier, Albert Smiler Marshall, who did not like the taste, saved his ration, finding that the alcohol helped as a sort of anaesthetic for the pain he suffered from trench foot. In between the conflict, boredom was intense. Albert remembered from his childhood the glamour of the redcoats as he watched them in admiration returning to his village after the Boer War. There was little glamour surrounding him in his trench. He missed 4 village Boxing Day celebrations, a day when the villagers would tie a lead and collar on all the pets, making a fine procession of pigs, goats, ferrets, cats, dogs, tame mice, and the splendid cockerel. The menagerie would race towards a greased pole in the middle of the green. The first to reach the dead duck attached to the top was the winner. Sergeant Jack Dinham found himself thinking of Otford, his village in Kent, where at the Boxing Day meet the hounds would be treated to porridge bubbling in huge steaming metal pans, while in summer the vicar, the Reverend William Lutyens, cricket-mad brother of the famous architect, would be seen in church, his white cricket flannels just visible beneath his cassock. Jack had wondered if his job at Knowle, the big house nearby, where he worked as Lord Sackville's coachman, would still be open to him after the war. While away at war, Siegfried Sassoon missed any sense of intellectual stimulus or even the reassurance of clarity of thought. Mental activity was clogged and hindered by gross physical actualities. Loneliness was constant. Men missed women. Most of all they missed their mothers and called aloud for them with increasing frequency. They sang a song together. H stands for happiness that you should find there. O stands for old folks in the old armchair. M stands for mother. You'll never find another, no matter where you roam. E stands for everyone, as everyone knows. HOME spells home. The men missed their wives and their fiancées too. The government and the army chiefs were well aware of the physical longings and the dangers of frustrated abstinence in an army made up largely of thousands of lusty young men, confused and ashamed of their feelings. Thousands of young British men had grown up in families where bodily functions and the natural instincts and affections of marriage went largely unmentioned. Even the coy inquiry concerning the proper functioning of the digestive system, "Are you consty?" from a mother to her child was too intimate to express in full. Not many men, however, remained ignorant of the ever-widening spread of venereal disease. Just behind the battle lines, only a mile or 2 from the front, girls waited to comfort men, irrespective of whether they were German, British, or French, waiting for them in abandoned chateaux, village houses, hay barns, caravans, farm buildings, and the upper floors of inns. Different coloured lanterns indicated the rank of clientele allowed entry. Blue denoted a place reserved for officers, the light sometimes swinging from a pole that stood next to a sign declaring, "No admittance for dogs and soldiers." Common soldiers were directed toward the red-light establishments. Sometimes the queues outside these places could number 100 men or more, with 3 worn-out Frenchwomen waiting inside. The price per slot varied from 2.5 to 10 francs, or 2 to 8 shillings, although a bartering system involving bread and sausages was also prevalent. One innocent young officer, hearing his turn called, made his way to room number 6, where in the bittersweet, dirt-smelling near darkness he could see the outline of a female figure, who, turning towards him, hiked up her black nightdress to her waist and fell backwards on the edge of the bed. He realized that the highly anticipated delights of seduction were already over. She was ready. These women estimated that, operating a strict schedule of 10 minutes per man, they could service an entire battalion every 7 days, a production rate that most were usually able to sustain for only 3 weeks before retiring exhausted and invariably unwell, but proud of their staying power. This experience had been, for many of the prospectively syphilitic young men, their introduction to the joy of physical love. Even the virginal Prince of Wales went, in 1916, with some fellow officers, to watch naked girls performing erotic poses in a brothel in Calais, concluding from his own first insight into such things that it was a perfectly filthy and revolting sight. Only the Austrian army paid much attention to either contraception or hygiene, the prostitute requiring her guest to use a preventative instrument. If he refused, the girl was to lubricate his organ with borated Vaseline, a paste made of boric acid, and after the experience was concluded, he was required to visit the disinfectant room. No such rules had applied to British troops, and the threat of venereal disease sometimes led soldiers to seek sexual relief with each other. The Field Almanac, issued to Lieutenant Skelton, cautioned men not to ease themselves promiscuously, although the detailed instructions on the necessity for cleanliness of the body at all times were impossible to implement in the filthy conditions of the camps. George V, hearing of the extent of homosexual activity in the army some 2 decades after the imprisonment of Oscar Wilde, had been heard to mutter, "I thought men like that shot themselves." There was also a belief that homosexuality might be infectious, and Scotland Yard kept a register of known homosexuals. Recovery from prosecution was at best rare, and in reality unknown. 270 soldiers and 20 officers were court-martialed for acts of gross indecency with another male person, according to the guidance notes in the Manual of Military Law. At home, morale was shored up by the belief in the value of sacrifice and the reflected pride it bestowed on those who survived. Edward Grey, the former Foreign Secretary, had said, "None of us who give our sons in this war are so much to be pitied as those who have no sons to give." For those who had died young, the lines of Lawrence Binyon's 1914 poem, with its Shakespearean echoes, continued to reverberate, as the idealization and myth-making of sacrifice was encouraged. "They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn." Nearly 10 million dead soldiers and sailors and airmen had died in the conflict, 750,000 from Britain. A further 12.5 million had been wounded. Nearly 1.75 million of these were British. An estimated 160,000 women lost husbands, and double that number of children emerged fatherless at the end of the war. An estimated 30% of all men aged between 20 and 24 in 1911 were now dead. There were no figures for the fiancés, girlfriends, mothers, children, grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends for whom life had changed forever. On the 11th of November 1918, the colossal roar finally stopped. Those who had survived hoped the wound would begin to heal in silence. After the catastrophic death of Victorian certainties, silence was beginning to seem like the only possible articulation of the truth. 2. Shock. Armistice Day, the 11th of November 1918.
Just after breakfast on a Monday morning in the middle of November, Maud Irons, the young woman from Liverpool who had become a signaller with the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, sat down at her stenograph, the shorthand machine she used in the little signal office at Boulogne. Her job was to relay messages to the front. That morning she tapped out the following words: "Hostilities will cease at 11 a.m. November the 11th. Troops will stand fast at the line reached at that hour, which will be reported to Army Headquarters. Defensive precautions will be maintained. There will be no intercourse of any description with the enemy. Further instructions follow." 3 hours after she had sent the communication, Maud took an involuntary glance at the clock in her office and saw that the moment the world had been waiting for had arrived. But nothing happened. There was silence. It was, observed Maud, as though France had just heaved a vast sigh of relief. Maud had arrived in Boulogne 18 months earlier on a lovely June day in 1917. She was excited at the prospect of joining her country's young men in teaching the Hun a lesson. Soon after her arrival she had made friends with some of the men. Her skill at the piano was warmly welcomed as she tried to please them with song after song, the requests coming with merciless rapidity. She had asked a Scottish private in the packed canteen how long he thought the war would last, and was surprised by his disillusioned response. "I don't care," he had replied. "All I want is home and wife and kiddies, and I don't care who England belongs to." Maud's earlier mood of eager anticipation gave way to a sense of unease as she worried that the seeming futility and endlessness of the war was eating into the souls of men. One of them, a look of inexpressible weariness on his face, described to her a job worse than that of fighting. "I've been digging up dead bodies, digging them up for their identification discs so that we can send word home. The fellow I was working with dug up his own brother and cried like a child." Maud found it impossible to look the man in the eyes as he spoke. Later that day, as Maud walked down towards the port, the eerie atmosphere persisted. Then as the church clock struck 3, every siren and hooter was let loose, every church bell clanged out, a deafening roar. But things were still not right. Even though the streets were packed with people, not a word was spoken, not a single cry of celebration was made. To Maud it seemed as if the stricken soul of France had not been able to find within itself the desire to rejoice. Suddenly her attention was caught by a sound, the noise and din, the sobbing of a woman, a few yards away. Fini, incroyable. Later on she remembered that almost unconsciously she had found herself in the little military cemetery behind the congested street of the town where our men were buried 3 deep, for land was dear in France, and where the graves had been so beautifully kept by the loving hands of a khaki girl. I could not distinguish the names for the mist of tears. Barely able to drag herself away, Maud stumbled and then almost fell over something in the ground, a broken piece of wood that had sunk so deep that it was scarcely visible. She had come across the grave of a German soldier, and, anxious not to be spotted, she hurriedly laid a few flowers at the foot of the broken cross. She knew that somewhere a woman was sorrowing. As soon as Maud's signal reached the field units, messengers on foot, bicycle and horseback spread out in all directions, carrying up to the troops at the front line pink slips of paper torn from signal pads on which news of the ceasefire was written. But the announcement that the war was over did not deter all those still caught up in the process of slaughter. 320 American soldiers lost their lives at Meuse on the morning of the 11th, with a further 3,000 wounded. General Pershing, commanding general of the American Expeditionary Forces, remained stubbornly reluctant to observe the ceasefire before teaching the Germans one final lesson. Many British soldiers on the front line were too exhausted to celebrate. A muted cheer and a half-hearted attempt to send a hat spinning in the air was the most that some could manage. There was no crossing over into the enemy lines for the gentlemanly shaking of hands. The comradeship felt for fellow human beings during the Christmas truce 4 years earlier had evaporated. In the northern French village of Malplaquet on the Belgian border, Brigade Major Wilfred House of the 57th Brigade wanted to demonstrate his gratitude for having survived the last 4 years. We hurriedly organised a tea with rationed food for all the children in the village school, and in their turn the villagers arrived with flowers and wine and pâté, and some rationed eggs and butter. Major House found the party to be very moving and very simple. In Paris, as the bells of Notre Dame began to ring, flags sold out in every shop, so the scientist Marie Curie, with the help of the daily lady from the Radium Institute, stitched together some blue, red and white material and hung the homemade flag from the Institute's window. In Germany, a young corporal of the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry lay on his hospital bed, wondering if he would ever fully regain his sight. A few weeks earlier he had been blinded in a gas attack after 4 years of fighting at the Western Front. The gas had begun to gnaw at his eyes, and although the cloudiness was beginning to clear, his vision was still hazy. The news of the armistice given to him in the convalescent hospital by the local padre reduced him to a state of despair as he thought of so many a dear friend and comrade who had died in the fighting. On hearing the news, the young soldier had tottered and groped his way back to the ward, and at the thought of defeat threw myself on my bunk and dug my burning head into my blanket and pillow. The medical staff were worried. They wondered if Corporal Adolf Hitler was going out of his mind. In Holland, a train was on its way to Arnhem. Inside a curtain-shuttered carriage sat the white-faced Kaiser Wilhelm. A chink in the curtains made it impossible for him to ignore the thousands of people who stood on the banks, shouting abuse as the train passed by, indicating with a swipe of the hand how they would like to cut the former leader's throat. In the English Channel, the crew of HMS Amazon, which was patrolling the stretch of sea at Beachy Head, were amazed to see a French fishing boat covered in flags. As fishermen shouted out that the war was over, the incredulous captain of the Amazon retorted that the boat should return to harbour at once and stop giving false hope to other passing ships. In London, a young diplomat, Harold Nicholson, was working in the basement of his office in Whitehall, sufficiently confident in the imminent announcement of an armistice that he was already drawing up plans for the proposed peace conference. In fact, he knew the ceasefire agreement had been signed in a railway carriage nearly 6 hours earlier in Compiègne. Leaving his desk for a moment in search of another map, Nicholson passed a window that overlooked the Prime Minister's official residence. The time was 5 minutes to 11 on the 11th of November. At that moment the door of number 10 was flung open and a hatless Lloyd George emerged. His thick white hair, barely restrained behind his ears, reflected the eagerness of his mood. "At 11 o'clock this morning the war will be over," Nicholson heard Lloyd George cry out, as if he was a street newspaper seller, hoping to attract the attention of anyone who might be listening. He repeated the words several times. As Nicholson watched, the street began to fill up, and within a few minutes there was no room to move. There was silence in the crowd, an interruption for cheering, and then silence again. But by this time Lloyd George appeared flustered, his flushed face in contrast to the bright white of his hair, which, owing to the absence of his customary Homburg, was now flying all over the place in the wind. After a burst from the crowd of "God Save the King," Lloyd George pushed his way back again through the mass of people towards the sanctuary of his famous front door. That afternoon, On the first day the guns fell silent, the announcement of the Kaiser's abdication and his flight to Holland was posted outside the Times office in Printing House Square. A group of passers-by gathered around the billboard and began to cheer, but the newspaper staff noted that the tone of the cheers was not hilarious. The shadows of the last few years remained, the reporter noted, even though the silver lining of passing clouds seemed to be reflected in the eyes of the passers-by. A week earlier, although there had been no official word that the Germans were planning a surrender, hundreds of German guns without public explanation or fanfare were placed along the length of the Mall from Buckingham Palace. Brought directly from the French battlefields, they resembled the wounded enemy soldiers themselves, pock-marked and stained. Final brutal evidence of the war had arrived in the heart of the capital. In New York there had been a muddle. On Thursday, the 6th of November, rumours that the end of the war was imminent had become so pronounced that they were taken for fact. Glancing out of the window of her couture cutting room onto the pavement below, Lucy Duff Gordon, the famous British dress designer, New York resident and survivor of the Titanic disaster 6 years earlier, was amazed to see old men letting off fireworks and staid-looking fathers kissing lovely young women who were quite clearly perfect strangers. At 2:30 p.m., the stock exchange closed, and 155 tons of ticker tape fluttered down into the street. Lucy found herself swept up in the excitement, and although her couture business had not been thriving in the manner she would have liked, she impulsively offered all her dress cutters time off and unlimited champagne for the rest of the day. The day passed, Lucy noted, in an orgy of celebration. As dusk was falling, another official announcement was made. It had been a false alarm. There was no armistice as yet. America, who had joined the war 19 months earlier, remained at war. 5 days later, on the 11th of November, New York felt both sheepish and exhausted, and Lucy noticed that the champagne they still felt compelled to drink had lost its fizz. In London, the newspaper compositors had been given 6 hours' notice for assembling the size of type suitable for announcing the news that people had been longing for. The armistice headlines were an inch high, and small boys on bicycles careered through the rain-drenched streets, carrying bundles of damp newspapers, yelling the single word, "Victory." In front of Buckingham Palace, the white marble statue of Queen Victoria turned black with the number of people who had climbed into the old sovereign's lap and clung to the winged statues that surrounded her seated figure. The royal family appeared briefly on the balcony, acknowledging the cheering crowds, a reassuring symbol for some that Britain was returning to normal. In London's East End, the 11 o'clock sirens were at first confused for those that announced an air raid. The death of several children in Poplar 2 years before, when a Zeppelin bomb had exploded in the grounds of a school, had not been forgotten. Children in Canning Town were terrified when a shop handed out armfuls of free fireworks. The noise made by the rockets and Catherine wheels were frighteningly reminiscent of the deadly German bombs. Duff Cooper, glamorous diplomat and grenadier, had returned from the battle lines a few days earlier. Back in London, he felt overcome with despondency and unable to go down into the streets and join the Armistice Day party. As he watched the scene below him, with the coloured fairy lights threaded through the tricoloured draperies, the cheering and the waving of flags, he was overcome with melancholy. He shuddered at the dancing and the noise of celebration and could think only of his friends, who were dead. After dining at the Ritz on food that was cold and nasty, he slipped away as soon as possible, feeling the infinite sadness of loss wash over his girlfriend, Diana Manners, reducing her to tears. There was another reason, however, for Duff's low spirits. He had a temperature of 102, and he suspected that he might be suffering from a sharp attack of influenza.
Florence Younghusband, wife of General George Younghusband, who had commanded British and Indian troops during the Turkish invasion of Egypt, was travelling on the top of a London bus at the moment of the ceasefire. In front of her was a soldier, his face shattered by a shell. As Florence watched, the soldier looked straight ahead and remained stonily silent. Suddenly the lady bus conductor collapsed into the seat beside her, and leaning her head on Florence's shoulder, she wept. Her husband, she confided to Florence, had died 2 months before, and she felt incapable of celebrating. Florence, whose husband had been invalided home in 1916, felt herself to be a lucky one. Susan and Tom Owen listened as the church bells of Shrewsbury began ringing, and said a prayer of thanks that their 3 sons had been spared before going to answer the knock on the front door. A young man stood outside patiently, a telegram in his hand. The news concerning Wilfred, their eldest boy, could not have been more terrible. Vera Brittain heard the sounds that signalled of the end of the war through the window of the London hospital annex, where her hands were buried deep in a basin of pinkish water. Standing in her nurse's uniform, she continued to wash out and disinfect the bloody dressing bowls. Her pointed chin was set firm in concentration at her task. She did not interrupt her work, because, like a sleeper who is determined to go on dreaming after being told to wake up, she had no interest in the jubilation going on outside the window. Only 3 years earlier she had written to her fiancé, contemplating this exact moment. Would she be one of those who take a happy part in the triumph, she had wondered, or instead would she listen to the merriment with a heart that breaks and ears that try to keep out the mirthful sounds? A few weeks after receiving the news in December 1915 that her 20-year-old fiancé Roland Leighton had been killed, Vera Brittain had gone to the house of Roland's parents. That morning the postman had delivered a large brown paper packet. When Vera walked into their sitting room, she had seen Roland's clothes laid out all over the floor, encrusted with mud. Here were clothes that showed what even a bluntly worded telegram could not show. The mud on this bedraggled set of garments had not the usual clean smell of earth, but it was as though it were saturated with dead bodies. Here was mud of a different kind to ordinary English mud, or even ordinary French mud. This was mud that clung, tenacious even when the struggle was over. This was death mud. In that moment, breathing in the dreadful smell of the jacket, the waistcoat, the breeches soaked in the dying blood of the man she had loved, Vera understood the reality of war, of decay, of mortality. Buried deep in an inner pocket, she had found the only possession of Roland's to escape the stench of death. A photograph of Vera herself. The warmth of his body had never lost the power to repel the damp and decay. Walking through the rain on the 11th of November 1918, with some fellow voluntary aid detachment nurses, Vera slowly registered that the streets were brightly lit for the first time in 4 years. Her joylessness grew with the same speed as the elation that surrounded her. No adored brother and no longed-for fiancé were here to celebrate with her. There was therefore nothing to celebrate. That evening, finding it impossible to recapture the lost youth that the war had stolen, she too realized for the first time, with all that full realization meant, that the world had altered irrevocably, and that the dead were dead and would never return. The novelist and spiritualist Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was sitting in the lobby of the Grosvenor Hotel in Park Lane. Exactly 2 weeks before Maud O'Nien's signal had gone out along the wires, Conan Doyle's son, weakened by a wound he had suffered in the war, had caught influenza and died. As Sir Arthur sat in the lobby, still barely able to register the catastrophic news, he saw a well-dressed woman push her way through the revolving doors of the hotel. Carrying a Union flag in each of her hands, she slid into a solitary waltz, slowly, elegantly, and silently making her way around the large lobby before spinning her way back through the circling door, then out again into the street. The novelist Arnold Bennett welcomed the damp, foggy day because at least it was an excellent thing to dampen hysteria and Bolshevism. He had noticed that in places there was a sort of madness in the air. Siegfried Sassoon was disgusted by what he saw. The poet was on sick leave in Oxford, where, in the corn market, he saw that a woman had tucked her skirts right up to her naked waist and was playing to the cheering crowd, waving a Union flag at the Army and Navy cadets with unashamed abandon. Taking the train up to London, Sassoon found an outburst of mob patriotism, a loathsome ending to the loathsome tragedy of the last 4 years. The morning's peace announcement had come as something of a surprise, and so it was not until later that many of the celebrants found their stride, but for some the effort was beyond them. Ottoline Morel, hostess, socialite, bohemian, friend of Virginia Woolf, felt too numb to respond to the news, her thoughts turning to the distress of the young children of German prisoners of war as she wondered how she could contribute to their new life in England. Perhaps she could arrange Morris dancing or carpentry lessons in the village hall where she lived at Garsington in Oxfordshire. That evening she emerged with the painter Mark Gertler into Charing Cross Road from a performance of the ballet at the Colosseum, and was confronted by a disturbing scene in the street. The lifeless arms of a very drunk young boy with one leg were being hauled over his crutches by 2 rough, thick-set men, but the arms would not stay in place. As the limp youth collapsed, his companions tried to drag him along the ground. Ottoline and Gertler crossed the road towards them, but the men spoke angrily, snapping at them to go away and leave them alone. War's contribution to this young man's life, Ottoline wrote later in her diary, had been to maim him in body and ruin him in soul. The Russian impresario Sergei Diaghilev was back in London on Armistice Night and had dined with the writer Osbert Sitwell in Swan Walk in Chelsea. After dinner, the party went up to Trafalgar Square, where they found a packed crowd, sometimes joining up, linking hands, dashed like the waves of the sea against the sides of the square, against the railings of the National Gallery, sweeping up so far even as beyond the shallow stone steps of St. Martin's in the Fields. Packed between the flag-waving, hat-brandishing revellers, cigarettes stuck to their lower lips, mouths opened wide to yell out the cheers, Sitwell examined Diaghilev's reaction to the scene. With something of the importance of a public monument attaching to his scale and build, bear-like in his fur coat, he gazed with an air of melancholy exhaustion at the crowds. Diaghilev often appeared exhausted. Excessive consumption of food seemed in particular to sap his energy. The French couturier, Coco Chanel, had noticed how, forehead already perspiring, the impresario would not even bother to remove his white gloves before helping himself to a proffered box of chocolates, continuing to finish the box, his fat cheeks and his heavy chin wobbling as he munched, his trousers held up by a couple of safety pins. Cynthia Curzon, known as Simmy to her friends, younger daughter of the former Viceroy of India, was also in Trafalgar Square, straddling a stone lion, a Union flag wrapped around her shoulders, watching the German guns that had been brought into the square from the Mall being set alight, while Simmy joined in with all those around her, belting out the rousing words of Land of Hope and Glory into the night air. A dark-haired officer of athletic appearance stood watching her, a look of despair on his face. On her descent to the pavement he challenged her elation. "Do any of you think for one moment of the loss of life, the devastation and misery?" he asked, a somewhat abashed Simmy.
The officer introduced himself. He was Oswald Mosley, and at the age of 21 was standing as coalition candidate for the Harrow seat at the following month's general election. Doris Scoville, assistant cook, was out on the town that night, her hand tucked into the crook of the arm of her sweetheart, the footman, Will Titley. They had both been given the evening off from their domestic duties below stairs at the grand house at 142 Piccadilly. The night of the 11th of November 1918 was an occasion for courting couples to go out and celebrate. Not far from number 142, a celebratory evening at the Savoy was threatening to get out of hand as delirious members of the RAF swung from the chandeliers. The following morning, the dustbins of the hotel contained 2,700 smashed glasses. Nearby in Regent Street, an exuberant young woman was sitting on the roof of a taxi, waving flags that she had snaffled from the shelves of Selfridge's department store. Restaurants and cafes that had been closed after 3 hours each evening for the last 4 years remained open to revellers until 11 p.m. by special order of the Prefect of Police. At the Apollo Theatre, the production of Arlette, starring Miss Winifred Barnes, was interrupted as Herbert Buckmaster, husband of the actress Gladys Cooper, watched a young man leap from a box onto the dress circle tier. Landing neatly on the stage, he threw himself into the leading lady's arms and gave her a resounding kiss. The audience howled with delight. Violet Capel was in a mood to feel a reckless sense of combined release and anticlimax. Despite the death of so many of Violet's friends, making her accustomed to requiring superhuman courage to open a newspaper, the end of the war coincided with the intense flowering of a great love affair. Although the object of her passion was in bed, alone, being monitored with some concern by her husband after an outbreak of flu, nothing could diminish Violet's personal happiness that day, not even the absence through illness of her lover, Vita Sackville West. On the evening of the ceasefire, David Garnett, a pacifist who had been working as a farm labourer at Charleston, the East Sussex farm of the painter Vanessa Bell, found the London streets milling with lorry-loads of ecstatic factory girls, bearing the yellow stains of acid that had leaked over their hands and faces as they made up the munitions. Exhilarated by the sight, Garnett met up with the artist Duncan Grant, and together they went to a flat in the Adelphi to join the critic Clive Bell, the painters Roger Fry and Dora Carrington, the economist Maynard Keynes, the Russian ballerina Lydia Lopokova, who had come straight from her performance in Scheherazade at the Colosseum, and Lytton Strachey, the fated author of the recently published biographical sketches Eminent Victorians. Osbert Sitwell and Diaghilev arrived at the party directly from Trafalgar Square, and Sitwell watched in surprise as the tall, flagging figure of Strachey, with his rather narrow angular beard, long inquisitive nose, jigged about with an amiable debility. Strachey, Sitwell concluded, was unused to dancing. Sitwell's brother Sacheverell was there too, confusing the uncomprehending Diaghilev, whose most fluent expression in English was "more chocolate pudding." And who could not understand why Sacheverell insisted on catching the last train to Aldershot? Who was this Aldershot? She must be very beautiful. Soon D.H. Lawrence arrived with his wife Frida, but Garnett was shocked by his friend's appearance. The light had left the famous novelist's eyes, and Garnett's loving greeting was received with a flatness bordering on indifference. Another friend, Cynthia Asquith, had noticed that the war had given Lawrence the appearance of someone in acute physical pain. Grief and anger combined to prompt him to confess to her that his soul had been fizzling savagely, and despite radiant lucid intervals, Cynthia Asquith thought him to be in a state of delirium. Garnett, hurt by the rebuff and incapable of an articulate response, gathered Carrington into his arms and whirled her into the centre of the room as someone began to play on the piano. But Lawrence's presence was impossible to ignore, and Garnet returned to hear him speak. "I suppose you think the war is over and that we shall go back to the kind of world you lived in before," Lawrence snapped, in a tone of deep scorn. "But the war isn't over," he continued, answering his own question. "The hate and evil is greater now than ever. It makes me sick to see you rejoicing like a butterfly in the last rays of the sun before the winter. Hate will be dammed up in men's hearts and will show itself in all sorts of ways which will be worse than war. Whatever happens, there can be no peace on earth." And with his words, joy and merriment left the room. Later, at Waterloo Station, Sir Several Sitwell, who was trying to catch the last train to Aldershot, saw groups of women staggering along the platform, so drunk that they had to be rolled along like milk cans and piled into the guard's van. The Countess of Fingal, the half-English, half-Irish society hostess, was also unable to see the promised benefits that a British victory would bring. "I used to think and say during the war that if ever that list of dead and wounded could cease, I would never mind anything or grumble at anything again," she recalled. "But when the armistice came at last, we seemed drained of all feeling. One felt nothing. We took up our lives again, or tried to take them up. The world we had known was vanished. We hunted again, but ghosts rode with us. We sat at table, and there were absent faces." Monica Grenfell, the sister of Julian and Billy, who had both lost their lives to the war, wrote to her mother, Lady Desborough, that day, of how she felt there to be agonizing sadness in this calm after strife. There had been no armistice celebration in East Peckham in Kent, where kindly Elizabeth Tester managed the village laundry. Despite her son Edward's efforts to be brave, his letters from the trenches had been profoundly upsetting. Mrs. Tester sensed the loneliness barely concealed between the jokey but highly accomplished line drawings. Ted, as he was known by all those who loved him, always had a talent, she told her friends, but the drawings and the cheery requests for a pot of his mother's homemade jam, the thought of which makes my mouth water, did not deceive his mother. Occasionally his homesickness slipped right through the bravado. "I don't think I shall grumble much about anything when I get back again," he had written to his mother. "I shall know how to appreciate a good home." And then, after the 2nd of October 1916, Edward had fallen silent. At the urging of her husband, Robert, on the 15th of November that year, Elizabeth Tester had sent a letter to the chaplain of the 11th Battalion of the Queen's Regiment to ask if they knew where Ted could be contacted. The final letter from France arrived just before Christmas, but it was not from Ted. Instead, the commanding officer wrote to tell Mrs. Tester that her much-liked son Edward had been killed by a shell on the 21st of October. 2 years later, his father Robert, who had suffered for many years from a weakness of the lungs, confided to his remaining daughter that with the death of Ted he had lost the will to live. A broken-hearted man, Robert had succumbed to the vicious influenza that had started to appear in communities up and down the country. 2 of the Testers' other children, Arthur and Daisy, had never known about the war, as both were too fragile to live beyond their 2nd birthdays. Bobby, the youngest boy, was suffering from a condition that severely restricted the maturing of his mind. But Nora, the eldest child, despite the loss of her brother and her fiancé in the trenches, was eager to help her mother. They both loved children, and Elizabeth had a canny business sense that helped to ensure her decimated family would remain clothed and fed. They would continue their pre-war practice of taking foundling children into the laundry.
The small sum paid to them by shamefaced relations for looking after children conceived but unwanted would be a help. And if Elizabeth was to face life without her husband, or Ted, Daisy, or Arthur, at least she could show her love to those children denied a loving home. 10-year-old Tom Mitford, lover of food, books, and football, in that order, was halfway through the autumn term at his boarding school in the country when the ceasefire came. For 3 days the pupils of Lockers Park in Hemel Hempstead had been practising singing "O God, Our Help in Ages Past" in preparation for a service to be held just after the announcement. A collection would be taken for the school memorial fund, and plans for a memorial window dedicated to the pupils who had died in the war were already under discussion. But in his weekly letter to his mother, Tom was more preoccupied with the cigarette cards that he collected than in the declaration of peace, begging her to send the cards as soon as possible so he could show his friends a complete set of 50 gems of Belgian architecture and the matching collection of military motors. His mother was not resistant to his request, and it made a change from the usual weekly plea for cake. No one was capable of refusing Tom anything, even if he coveted something that already belonged to someone else. His sisters knew of the trick that he had been perfecting since the age of 7, and which between them was referred to as the artful scheme of happiness. Tom was so practised at getting his own way that he could make his voice positively sag with desire. But annoying as he could be, the 5 daughters adored their only brother, and always showed that they, in his eldest sister Nancy's words, had missed him dreadfully when he returned for the holidays. His mother secretly hoped that she might one day have another child, and that it would be a brother for Tom. 3-year-old Jeremy Nicholas Hutchinson was caught up in the excitement of the day. Standing with his parents in the garden of their rented house at Robertsbridge in Sussex, he suddenly heard a whoop and a cheer. Galloping towards them, bare-backed on the farm pony and at an unnerving pace, was the figure of the farm boy from next door. In his urgency to deliver the most dramatic piece of news of his life, he had completely forgotten to saddle up. Unable to control the speed of the animal, he attempted to come to an elegant standstill in front of his small, astonished audience, but instead was catapulted into the November mud, landing face down in the country muck. The spread-eagled imprint that remained in the mud after the boy had stood up and breathlessly announced the end of the war was pronounced by the amused adults to be the boy's trademark. This was the first long word that young Jeremy had heard, and he knew that he would never forget either the word or the circumstances in which he had first heard it. For 10-year-old Daisy Brooker, the day was one of the rare occasions when her parents and all her 9 brothers and sisters were together in one place. Now that she knew the war was over, she was looking forward to getting rid of the hated oblong ration books with a sort of faint paisley pattern on the pages that entitled the huge family to one tiny allocation each of margarine and plum jam. The faggots were so full of pepper and the peas pudding so dry it was agony to get it down my throat, Daisy grumbled. I vowed I'd never buy it when I had a choice. To celebrate the armistice, the whole family, including baby George, went on an outing to the seafront at Brighton and along to the West Pier. Everyone seemed to be singing and dancing, soldiers and sailors in uniform, the worse for drink, staggering around. We then walked back through the town, and we all went in a cafe where Dad bought a large jug of tea and 1 cup, which we took turns in drinking out of. My legs ached with walking, and I longed to have a ride in the pram, if only someone would carry George, but no, it did not happen. But being with her family, knowing the war was over, made the 11th of November 1918 a day she would never forget. That evening, Lloyd George made a speech at the Guildhall. Those who heard it, and those who read the reports the following day, should have been in no doubt. Despite the millions of deaths that had occurred in the name of love of country, patriotism remained undiluted. The Prime Minister was cheered at almost every phrase. He spoke of the unity of effort, sorrow and sacrifice. "Now," he declared, "we have our brotherhood of joy." And to enthusiastic cheers he cried, "Let it not end here. Let us resolve that we shall place loyalty to the land we love first and last, the land whose efforts on sea, in the air, and on the earth have done so much to redeem the world from a scourge that was menacing its liberties." And rising to his emotional theme, he concluded, "We sank all our sectional interests, all partisan claims, all class and creed differences in the pursuit of one common purpose." Such patriotism, he hoped, would continue to unify the British throughout the challenges of the coming years. On the same evening, a young mother was spending a few days at her family cottage in Cornwall. She was alone there with Dennis, her 8-year-old son, who thought of his mother as a magical figure. Edna Clark Hall had been a student at the Slade, but her unhappy marriage, as well as her grief at the death 18 months earlier of a beloved friend, the writer Edward Thomas, had propelled her into a state of emotional paralysis. Painting had become impossible for her. Instead, she had become accustomed to writing poems, sometimes as many as a dozen a day, in which to record her feelings. Her poem, Peace Night, reflected a rare optimism that night, a survival of sorts, inspired by the child beside her. "So I am like a gypsy on the dark hillside, in the weird reflection of a nation's pride, and you are like a pixie, oh my pretty child, and this hill our Dixie, strange and dark and wild. When we are long forgotten in our mortal dress, I with my red blanket, you with your sweetness, by the lonely ocean still will we abide, elfin boy and gypsy on the dark hillside." But another poet, Thomas Hardy, now nearly 80 years of age, raged at the futility of it all, attacking the motives of a world that in its brute-like blindness could have allowed this 4 years' dance of death. In a poem written on Armistice Day, a day in which there was peace on earth and silence in the sky, he foresaw the legacy of the preceding years. Some could not shake off misery. The sinister spirit sneered. It had to be. And again the spirit of pity whispered, "Why?" Virginia Woolf spent Armistice Day at the dentist, returning home to write her diary that night in a state of despair. Every wounded soldier was kissed by women. Nobody had any notion where to go or what to do. It poured steadily. Crowds drifted up and down the pavements, waving flags and jumping into omnibuses, but in such a disorganized, half-hearted, sordid state that I felt more and more melancholy and hopeless of the human race. They make one doubt whether any decent life will ever be possible, or whether it matters if we are at war or at peace. Private John Robinson was one of the lucky ones. He had received his demobilization papers a week before the armistice, and on his arrival home had gathered his family, including his 7-year-old boy, in the front room. As they watched, the former soldier began to remove every article of the uniform he wore until he stood naked before them. Gathering up the muddy, bloody, ragged, sweat-soaked pile of clothes that lay on the floor, Mrs. Robinson threw the whole lot into the fire as the whole family, including their young son, watched the flames. They promised each other that war would never be mentioned in the Robinson family again. Mrs. Bullock, who had waved her son goodbye with such pain in her heart, had also been pleased that John had been sent home early, despite the reason being prompted by the injuries he had received in the war. She consoled herself that at least he was alive and once again enjoying the park as she watched from the window, marvelling at his remarkable agility as he propelled himself forward with his crutches on his remaining leg. Back in London, lurking in the shadows and far from the brightly lit entrances to hotels from where the party revellers were beginning to make their unsteady way home, were the men who could no longer attract the warmth of a woman's embrace, their faces unable to register relief, joy, or any emotion at all. These were the war veterans, facially damaged beyond all recognition. Sometimes a mask was the only solution to any semblance of normality, but the mask itself, immobile, expressionless, resounded with a metallic ping should it encounter any hard object, and had become a thing of revulsion. Maud Irons found herself in a town 10 miles from her stenographer's base near Boulogne. She had been visiting the wounded. A truck driver stopped and asked her if she wanted a lift back to Wimereux. He cautioned her, however, that she might not like it, as there was a fellow passenger in the back of the truck. The passenger had glimpsed his own face in a mirror, and seeing it to be battered out of recognition, decided what he must do next. The driver told Maud that he did away with his identity disc first, and himself afterwards. Trying to cheer up her driver as she sat up in front with him, the corpse with his shattered face lying in the back, Maud attempted to make conversation. "So it's over at last," she said, but the driver could not agree. "I'd change places with him gladly," he assured her, with a jerk of the head towards the corpse in the back. "The war, for me, is only just beginning." Maud's chauffeur had heard that his wife had been sleeping with another man, and the prospect of home as a place of refuge and warmth had been destroyed. The end of the war was, for this soldier at least, the end of the happiness he had known, and the start of a life of uncertainty.
3. Denial. Christmas 1918. As women prepared for the homecoming of their men, shiny lipstick and new teeth found their way into even the poorest homes. No matter what the expense, a mouthful of flashing pots was the goal of many waiting for the return of their husbands. The poet T.S. Eliot lived above a pub and heard the discussions. "Now, Albert's coming back. Make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you've done with that money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. He did. I was there. You have them all out, Lil, and get a nice set." In the first months after the war, the act of survival itself had been a cause for celebration, and the peacetime silence brought with it a relief that people had long dreamt of. At the pre-Christmas general election on the 14th of December, when the wartime coalition government was seeking a return to office, Lloyd George had promised that serving men would be returning to a land fit for heroes. But the long-anticipated reunions often met with bitter disappointment. Wives, mothers, fiancées, sisters, friends were reunited with men who had been changed irrevocably, both physically and mentally, by the horror and brutality they had been subjected to. These men neither looked nor sounded like heroes. Marriages conducted in haste during the war had often taken place in the fear that there would never be another chance. The prolonged absence of a husband gave time for reflection, and often led both husband and wife to think again about their speedy commitment to one another. The divorce rate began to rise so rapidly that in the 12 months after the war ended, the courts processed 3 times as many divorces as they had in the year before the war began. Judges began to complain of congestion in the system. Gladys Cooper was considered the most beautiful woman on the London stage. Her audiences cared little about the content of the play, nor indeed, to the actress's frustration, were they too bothered about the calibre of her acting. They were simply happy to sit in their seats and stare at her beautiful face. She and her husband Herbert Buckmaster had written to each other almost every day for 3.5 years during his absence at the front. They had promised each other that they would make up for all this hell of being parted when the war is over. But on Buck's return he realized his wife had been accustomed to do without me and to manage her own life. Gladys's earnings had shot up from £20 a week at the beginning of the war to £200 at its end. Her new friends were the Prince of Wales, Ivor Novello, and Sybil Thorndyke. His friends were men like him who had not been blown to pieces in the trenches. He planned to open a club in London where the military veterans could gather and talk about things that no one, especially wives, had experienced. Gladys and Buck realized they no longer had anything in common. Their marriage was over. For some whose love lives had been disrupted by the war, there was a guarded anxiety that they might never recover their emotional stability. Violet Elliot Murray Kinninmount, daughter of the Earl of Minto, Viceroy of India, had been married in 1909 at the age of 20 to her father's aide-de-camp, Charles Petty Fitzmaurice, youngest son of the Marquess of Lansdowne. The marriage was a love match. People remarked on the beauty and devotion of the young couple. They had 2 children. A shell unleashed high into the air at Ypres in 1914, and the death of her father in the same year wrecked Violet's happiness. Her friends wondered how she and her 2 children would manage, now she was not only widowed, but fatherless. 2 years later, however, Violet had married again. Nothing unseemly or hasty was attributed to this fact. The omnipresence of death and grief was seen as a reason for behaviour that, out of the context of war, might have been considered inappropriate, particularly among the upper classes. People understood that isolation, particularly in youth, could paralyse a life. A new husband would provide comfort for Violet and a father figure for her children. Many friends, men and women, had written letters of congratulation on the marriage, and almost all mentioned the blessed news that Violet's loneliness was at an end. Etty Desborough, familiar herself with war's cruel blows, sent her one line of great love and every happy wish that I can think of in the whole world. The Duchess of Devonshire expressed her delighted wishes, while a particularly loving note arrived on Irish Guard stationery from Kerry, from Henry Petty Fitzmaurice, Violet's former brother-in-law. John Renton, the much-adored factor at the estate office at Miclure, the family house of Violet's former husband, near Perth, wrote of the high esteem in which your ladyship and the little children have always been held by the tenants, and hoped that she would continue to come and visit them all there. Only one letter referred to the agony of decision, and only 2 confronted and dismissed the concept of disloyalty. Violet had collected up the large bundle of letters, several of them banded by the black margin of personal mourning, and folded a blank sheet of paper around them. She had written on the paper the words, "Congratulations, June 1916, in black ink, and put the letters safely away. Violet's new husband was John Jacob Astor, a member of the vastly rich American family who had made their money in the last century in fur trading and real estate. John's father, William Waldorf, owned the Observer newspaper. A cousin, John Jacob IV, had drowned in the Titanic. A brother, Waldorf, was a member of Parliament and lived with his wife, Nancy, at Cliveden in Berkshire, a hub for the most distinguished political and social gatherings of the war. Violet did not object when John, a reticent and complicated man, asked his wife to pack away all Charlie's photographs and possessions. A short while after the wedding, John Jacob returned to the war and had his right leg blown off. Back home again, John suffered a continuous and dreadful pain in the remaining part of the limb and retreated to his rooms, occupying himself with his passion for painting. One day his new wife walked into her husband's studio to find him at an easel painting a nude model. Moving to open the window, Violet remarked, "Yes, darling, I do agree, it is hot in here," and left the room, making no further comment. A woman of impressive resilience, Violet considered silence to be the most prudent response. But deep within the silent recesses of her private sitting-room at Hever Castle in Kent was a secret. Here, in the place where Anne Boleyn had loved and lost Henry VIII, the lovely and romantic place that her new husband had inherited on his father's death, Violet had prized open a brick or two, and within the cavity behind had placed her favourite photographs, a lock of hair, the cufflinks and the medals that had belonged to the man she would always love best. After the war was over, being with their 2 children and holding these precious things lessened the loneliness that still gripped her. In the weeks leading up to the first peaceful Christmas for 4 years, advertisements began to appear suggesting presents that would not have found a place in leisure magazines before the war. In many houses that Christmas, furniture was moved out of the way to make room for spanking new cane wheelchairs. The Illustrated London News recommended an ingenious gadget for individuals who had lost their arms. By the manipulation of a flat lever with 2 stockinged feet, a plate balanced on top of the lever could be made to rise towards the armless diner's mouth. Forks and spoons could be made to levitate towards the mouth in a similar way. On the 13th of December, the same magazine was promoting an intriguing choice of gift in the Ellison Carrier electric Invalids Carriage, a contraption that heralds a new era. The Ellison, capable of speeds of up to 5 miles per hour, afforded the disabled person the freedom from nurse, attendant or bath chair man, as well as an opportunity to breathe in fresh air. These self-propelling invalid chairs were in plentiful supply from Gerald's, the medical supplies store, and a photograph in the Daily Sketch on the 17th of December showed a charming model, well wrapped up, but smiling broadly as she demonstrated